Sometimes a death seems just too neat to be an accident. On the morning of February 9th, 2023, in a quiet residential neighborhood in West Carroll Parish, Louisiana, a woman named Crystal McCrory Jones was found dead in her bedroom with a gunshot wound to the head. The scene appeared straightforward: a handgun in her right hand, a pillow over her face, no signs of forced entry. Within 90 minutes, local law enforcement had ruled her death a suicide. But what investigators called closure, Crystal's family saw as abandonment. The house where she died belonged to a deputy sheriff. The officers who declared the case solved were his colleagues. And in the months that followed, a pattern emerged, not of answers, but of erasures. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. This is the story of Crystal McCrory Jones, a case that reveals how power, proximity, and institutional loyalty can bury the truth beneath a single, convenient narrative. Crystal McCrory was born on May 17, 1979, in Crossett, Arkansas, a small timber town near the Louisiana border, where logging trucks rumbled through pine forests and families knew each other by first names. Her parents, Johnny and Doyle McCrory, raised 4 children in a home that valued hard work, loyalty, and faith. Crystal was the second child and the only daughter, sandwiched between older brothers Dean and Josh and a younger sister, Jana. From an early age, she stood out, not because she sought attention, but because she had a natural warmth that drew people in. Teachers remembered her as the girl who could diffuse tension in a classroom with a well-timed joke. Friends described her as the one who always remembered birthdays, who checked in when you were struggling, who made you feel seen. In 1997, Crystal graduated from Bastrop High School. Like many young people in small southern towns, she felt the pull between staying close to family and finding her own path. She married her high school sweetheart, Jeremy, shortly after graduation. The young couple moved to Monroe, Louisiana, where Crystal found work as a server at an olive garden. It was the kind of job that demanded patience, multitasking, and the ability to read people quickly, skills Crystal had in abundance. Her co-workers recall her as someone who could turn a difficult customer around with genuine empathy, who remembered regulars' orders, who stayed late to help close even when she didn't have to. She and Jeremy had a son together, and for a time, life seemed to follow a predictable rhythm: work, home, family gatherings on weekends. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The demands of new parenthood, financial pressures, and the strains of a marriage begun too young began to take their toll. Crystal rarely complained publicly, but those closest to her noticed the fatigue in her eyes, the way conversations about the future became vaguer. The marriage faltered, then failed. In search of a fresh start, Crystal made a bold decision. She moved to New York City. For a woman who had spent her entire life in the rural South, the transition was jarring. The pace, the anonymity, the sheer scale of the city. It was nothing like the tight-knit communities she knew. She struggled to find steady work. The cost of living was staggering, and perhaps most difficult, she was far from her family, the network that had always been her foundation. After a year, Crystal returned to Louisiana. She didn't see it as defeat, she saw it as recalibration. She was older now, wiser about what she needed to thrive. She reconnected with friends, found stability in work, and focused on being present for her son. And then she met Tony Jones. He was confident, composed, a man who seemed to have his life in order. He worked in law enforcement for the West Carroll Parish Sheriff's Office, a position that carried weight in a small community. He was disciplined, physically fit from years of martial arts training, and projected an aura of reliability. To Crystal, who had endured instability and uncertainty, Tony seemed like solid ground. They married, and Crystal had a second son with Tony. Together, they opened a martial arts gym, combining Tony's expertise with Crystal's organizational skills. On paper, it looked like a partnership. Tony taught classes and handled the physical side of the business. Crystal managed schedules, billing, customer relations, and marketing. She also continued working at State Farm Insurance, where she had steadily climbed from administrative assistant to office representative. Her colleagues at State Farm describe her as meticulous, dependable, someone who could explain complex policy details in plain language, and make clients feel genuinely cared for. She wasn't chasing promotions or accolades. She simply took pride in doing her job well. At home, Crystal became the center of a blended family. She cared for Tony's children from a previous marriage as if they were her own, never making distinctions, never playing favorites. She hosted holiday dinners, organized birthday parties, made sure homework was done and lunches were packed. Her house was open to anyone who needed a place to talk, a meal, or just company. Friends remember dropping by unannounced and finding Crystal at the kitchen table, coffee brewing, always ready to listen. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was building something quieter and more valuable, a sense of home. But beneath the surface, the relationship with Tony was shifting. At first, the changes were subtle. He wanted to know where she was going, who she was meeting, when she would be back. He framed it as concern, as love. But over time, the questions became interrogations. Crystal found herself explaining routine errands, justifying conversations with co-workers, accounting for her time in ways that felt increasingly suffocating. Tony's need for control extended beyond their personal life. He began inserting himself into her work at State Farm, asking detailed questions about her schedule, her clients, her interactions with colleagues. He would call her multiple times during the day, sometimes under the guise of checking in, other times demanding immediate responses. Outwardly, Tony maintained his calm, professional demeanor. To those who knew him through work, he was a steady presence, a dependable deputy. But at home, Crystal was walking on eggshells. She learned to anticipate his moods, to avoid topics that might trigger suspicion or anger. She stopped confiding in friends as openly as she once had. She became quieter, more guarded. The financial dynamics of their household only deepened the tension. The martial arts gym, which Tony had envisioned as a thriving business, was barely breaking even. It was Crystal's salary from State Farm that covered the mortgage, the utilities, the groceries. For a man who prided himself on being the provider, the protector, this shift was intolerable. Arguments became more frequent. Tony's frustration manifested not in shouting or obvious violence, but in cold withdrawal, in passive-aggressive comments, in a steady erosion of trust. In the final months of Crystal's life, their relationship had turned glacial. She began noticing inconsistencies in Tony's explanations for his whereabouts. He would claim to be at work, but his hours didn't match his schedule. He would say he was running errands, but the timeline didn't add up. Crystal, who had spent years reading people's faces, sensing when something was off, couldn't ignore her instincts. She did something she never thought she would do. She began using Google's location sharing feature to track Tony's movements. What she found confirmed her suspicions. His location data contradicted the stories he told. He was spending time in places he hadn't mentioned, with people he hadn't disclosed. Crystal didn't confront him with the evidence. Not yet. But she confided in Jana, her younger sister, telling her that things at home felt wrong, that Tony was pulling away, that she didn't know what was coming next. At work, Crystal's colleagues noticed the change. She was still professional, still dependable, but the light in her eyes had dimmed. She seemed distracted, preoccupied. One co-worker later recalled a conversation where Crystal mentioned feeling like a zombie, a side effect of medication she had been prescribed for anxiety and insomnia. But even as she struggled, she made it clear to those around her that she was holding on for her sons. She talked about their futures, about college plans, about wanting to see them grow up. She made plans for the weekend, discussed work projects that extended into the following month. There was no indication, in word or action, that she was planning to end her life. Then, just days before February 9th, something strange happened. Tony disconnected the security camera that monitored the front of their house. When Crystal asked why, he offered a vague explanation. The camera was in the way. He didn't specify of what. At the time, it seemed like a minor, even mundane decision. But in hindsight, it would raise a question that no one could satisfactorily answer. What was he preparing for? The morning of February 9th, 2023, began unremarkably. Crystal woke up before Tony, feeling a persistent sense of fatigue. She wasn't alarmingly ill, but she felt off, lightheaded, weak, unable to shake a low-grade unease. Trusting her body's signals, she scheduled a doctor's appointment for 2:30 that afternoon. Her younger son, then 16, was getting ready for school. Her older son, now 25 and living independently, had called the night before to discuss plans for the upcoming weekend. Crystal had assured him she would be there. Around 8 o'clock in the morning, Tony left for work. That left Crystal alone in the house, accompanied only by Rocket, the family dog. She settled into her usual routine. She brewed coffee, turned on the radio, ran a bath. She took her time styling her hair and applying makeup. To anyone observing her that morning, had anyone been watching, she would have appeared composed, purposeful, preparing for a day ahead. Her text messages to friends that morning were brief and unremarkable. Nothing in her tone suggested distress. At 10:06 a.m., Crystal spoke to Tony on the phone for approximately 20 minutes. According to Tony's later account, the conversation was routine. Her voice was steady. She mentioned her upcoming doctor's appointment. She talked about errands she planned to run. When the call ended, Tony claimed he had no reason to believe anything was wrong. But after that conversation, Crystal went silent. She stopped responding to texts. She didn't answer follow-up calls. At first, this didn't raise alarms. Tony assumed she had gone to her appointment, perhaps turned off her phone, perhaps was resting. But by 3:45 p.m., when he called the medical clinic and learned that Crystal had never shown up, concern began to creep in, or so he later claimed. At 4:02 p.m., Tony made a decision that would become one of the most scrutinized details of the entire case. Instead of driving home, he was only 30 minutes away, he called Chief Deputy Chuck Harris and asked him to check on the house. Harris arrived within 10 minutes. Crystal's car was parked in the driveway. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house appeared orderly. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. A coffee mug sat on the kitchen table, the liquid inside long since gone cold. Harris walked toward the master bedroom. Rocket, the family dog, was lying on the bed, unusually still, his eyes wide, his body tense. And there, on the bed, was Crystal. She was lying on her back, motionless. Part of her face was covered by a pillow. The pillow had a single, clean bullet hole through it. Harris immediately called Tony to inform him of what he had found. Tony did not rush to the house. Instead, he remained on the phone with Harris, asking questions, receiving updates. He did not express panic. He did not demand to see his wife. He stayed where he was, speaking in measured tones, asking for procedural details. Less than an hour after Harris discovered Crystal's body, the official determination was made. Self-inflicted gunshot wound. Suicide. The bedroom, now a crime scene, was eerily pristine. In Crystal's right hand was a 9mm Ruger pistol, but something was immediately wrong. The firearm had not chambered a new round. In a semi-automatic handgun, the recoil from a fired shot typically ejects the spent casing and loads a fresh round into the chamber. The fact that this had not occurred suggested either a mechanical failure or that the weapon had been manipulated after the shot was fired. Either possibility demanded further investigation, but no such investigation was conducted. Then there was Crystal's hand itself. One of her fingernails was visibly broken, the damage consistent with sudden, forceful contact, perhaps a jerking motion, perhaps resistance, perhaps a struggle. The nail was not simply chipped, it was cracked and torn in a way that suggested trauma. Yet this detail was not flagged as significant in the initial assessment. And then there was Rocket, the dog. Those who knew him described him as friendly, calm, unflappable. But when Harris entered the room, Rocket was frozen in place, his body rigid, his eyes locked on something unseen. Animals, particularly dogs who live closely with their owners, are highly attuned to distress. Rocket's behavior suggested that he had witnessed something profoundly disturbing. Deputy Harris took photographs of the scene, but the number of photographs was shockingly inadequate. Fewer than 40 images were captured in total. For a death investigation, even one initially presumed to be a suicide, this was far below standard protocol. A thorough documentation would include wide-angle shots of the entire room, close-ups of the body from multiple angles, detailed images of all objects in proximity to the deceased, photographs of doors, windows, locks, and any potential points of entry or exit. None of this was done comprehensively. The room was not sealed. In fact, it remained accessible. Tony, as the homeowner, retained unrestricted access to the house even after Crystal's body was removed. No neighbors were interviewed, despite the fact that homes in the area were close together and a gunshot, even one muffled by a pillow, would likely have been audible. No canvassing was conducted to determine if anyone had seen unfamiliar vehicles in the area or noticed unusual activity. The investigation, in any meaningful sense, never happened. Within 90 minutes of discovering Crystal's body, the case was closed. The official narrative was set. Crystal McCrory Jones had taken her own life. While investigators moved quickly to close the case, Crystal's younger son was moved to a neighbor's house for his safety. He didn't know yet what had happened. When his Aunt Jana arrived, she found him trembling, unable to process the fragments of information he had overheard. Once he learned the truth, he refused to return home for weeks. He couldn't bring himself to enter the house where his mother had died. Crystal's older son, now 25, received the news from Jana by phone. He drove down that evening, arriving to find the house cordoned off with police tape, the case already declared resolved. What he expected to be the beginning of an investigation turned out to be its end. Meanwhile, Tony maintained close contact with the officers handling the scene. The fact that these officers were his colleagues created an obvious conflict of interest, one that no one in the department seemed willing to acknowledge. Tony's account of the day was taken at face value. He described Crystal as depressed, claimed her death was not entirely unexpected, and suggested that she had been struggling with mental health issues for some time. This version of events, stripped of context and unverified, became the official narrative. None of the officers pressed for corroboration. None sought out Crystal's family, friends, or co-workers to confirm whether her behavior in the days and weeks before her death aligned with Tony's description. Jana, Crystal's sister, was denied access to the house when she attempted to retrieve personal belongings. She was told the scene had been cleared, but law enforcement retained Crystal's clothing, her phone, her documents, even her makeup. Shortly after Crystal's body was removed, Tony locked up the house, took Rocket, and informed the family that they were no longer welcome without his explicit permission. The home that had once been filled with laughter, with the sounds of children running through hallways, with the warmth of family gatherings, had become a sealed vault. The family's attempts to access information, to understand what had happened, to simply mourn in the spaces where Crystal had lived, were systematically blocked. From the very beginning, Tony's account of February 9th was inconsistent. In his initial statement, he described a straightforward morning. He left for work, made a stop at a client's location, visited a bank. But as days passed and he was asked to recount his movements, new details emerged. He mentioned stopping at a local cafe called Bakery Barn. Then he added a haircut appointment. Later, he said he had picked up his daughter from school and bought her food at a Sonic drive-in. He claimed he had tried to reach Crystal throughout the afternoon without success. Yet despite being only 30 minutes from home and knowing his wife had missed a doctor's appointment she had specifically scheduled because she felt unwell, he did not drive home to check on her. Tony's timeline became increasingly tangled. In one version, he was at the martial arts gym. In another, he claimed to be bowling. The times he said he called Crystal did not match the call logs retrieved from cell phone records. When Crystal stopped responding to messages, Tony did not contact her family, her friends, or her co-workers. His first call was to Deputy Sheriff Chuck Harris. The tone of that conversation, according to those who later reviewed the records, was calm, measured, almost procedural. There was no audible panic, no frantic urgency. To some observers, it felt less like a worried husband reaching out for help and more like someone executing a pre-planned sequence of actions. 9 days after Crystal's body was discovered, Tony informed investigators that he had found a bullet casing. He claimed he came across it while cleaning the bedroom, specifically under the vanity near where Crystal's body had been found. According to Tony, the casing had been partially obscured by hairstyling products and shadows created by the furniture. He said he hadn't intentionally disturbed anything. He simply moved a few items on the floor and noticed something metallic. He turned the casing over to the sheriff's office, explaining that the layout of the room and the lighting conditions must have prevented investigators from spotting it during the initial search. Law enforcement accepted this explanation without question. They logged the casing as evidence and claimed it appeared in one of the original photographs taken on the day of the incident. But Jana, Crystal's sister, was not convinced. She requested access to every photograph taken at the scene. She examined each image meticulously, zooming in on the area under the vanity, studying the floor from multiple angles. Her conclusion was unambiguous. The casing was not there. In every photograph where the floor beneath the vanity should have been visible, you could see furniture legs, a few scattered items, but no metallic glint, no shadow consistent with a bullet casing, no indication whatsoever that this critical piece of evidence had been present during the initial documentation. This created a profound contradiction. On one side, a late discovery reported by the deceased's husband, a man who had unrestricted access to the house for more than a week. On the other side, photographic evidence that, according to independent review, did not support the presence of the casing at the time the scene was originally documented. With fewer than 40 total images captured that day, the scene had not been documented thoroughly enough to establish a complete chain of custody. There was no way to definitively trace the casing's location from the moment of the incident to the time Tony claimed to have found it. The room had not been sealed properly after Crystal's body was removed. Tony had been free to enter and exit as he pleased. The chain of custody, one of the most fundamental principles in forensic investigation, had been completely broken. For nearly 10 days, the casing was outside of law enforcement's control. Its discovery, its location, even its existence depended entirely on Tony's word. While police eventually logged, packaged, and labeled it according to protocol, one critical question remained unanswered. How did it end up there? Without independent verification, without consistent documentation, the casing's origin could not be proven, yet its discovery fit seamlessly into the official narrative. It supported the conclusion of a self-inflicted gunshot. It filled a gap in the physical evidence. But to Crystal's family, it felt staged, a piece of evidence that appeared in the one place where it could be easily explained, conveniently reinforcing the version of events the investigation had already accepted. From that moment on, the bullet casing became emblematic of the case's deeper problems. For law enforcement, it was confirmation of the obvious. For the family, it was proof of tampering, of manipulation, of a truth that had been deliberately obscured. When Crystal's autopsy and forensic records were later reviewed, serious inconsistencies emerged. These were not minor clerical errors. They were fundamental contradictions that called into question the integrity of the entire investigative file. In the document headers, Crystal's name was misspelled. The recorded dates of birth and death did not match across different reports. Even the case numbers listed on accompanying paperwork were inconsistent, breaking the official chain of documentation. One of the most glaring irregularities involved the recorded time of death. The original report listed it as 10:35 a.m., but that entry was later crossed out and replaced with 5:05 p.m., a difference of more than 6 hours. No explanation was provided for this revision. There was no notation indicating who made the change, when it was made, or why it was deemed necessary. Standard post-mortem analysis includes a range of diagnostic indicators used to estimate time of death: body temperature, the progression of rigor mortis, the onset and distribution of livor mortis, the pooling of blood in the lowest parts of the body after circulation stops, and the condition of tissues and fluids. None of these details were documented in Crystal's case. No body temperature readings were recorded. No data about tissue dryness, muscle stiffness, or lividity development were provided. The absence of these fundamental measurements made it impossible to verify the revised time of death, or to assess whether the original estimate had been erroneous or deliberately altered. Then came another critical discrepancy involving the description of Crystal's pelvic area. In the initial autopsy report, the notation read, "Reproductive organs not identifiable." In the revised version, that line was replaced with "hysterectomy noted." This was not a trivial change. It represented a fundamental alteration of medical findings, yet there were no surgical photographs, no autopsy images documenting the presence of surgical scars, and no external indicators of a past hysterectomy. Changing such a significant medical detail without visual or written corroboration raised serious concerns about the accuracy of the findings and whether internal injuries or other trauma had been misinterpreted or overlooked. Even the documentation of post-mortem discoloration did not align with the physical evidence. The revised report documented significant lividity on both the back and the front of Crystal's body, but Crystal was found lying on her back. Lividity develops in the parts of the body that are lowest, where blood pools due to gravity after the heart stops beating. If Crystal had remained on her back from the time of death until discovery, lividity should have been present only on her back. The presence of lividity on her front suggested that her body had been in a different position at some point after death and before it was found. Yet the report made no mention of movement, no estimate of how long the body might have been repositioned, and no timeline to explain the contradictory evidence. One of the most fundamental forensic tests in any shooting investigation is the gunshot residue test, commonly known as GSR analysis. This test determines whether a person's hands show traces of the microscopic particles released when a firearm is discharged. It is standard procedure in cases of suspected suicide, as it helps confirm whether the deceased actually fired the weapon. In Crystal's case, no GSR test was conducted, no residue swabs were taken from her hands, no microscopic trace analysis was performed, no lab protocols were logged. Without this critical data, there was no scientific way to confirm whether Crystal had ever held or fired the weapon found in her hand. Taken together, these inconsistencies were not signs of mere sloppiness. The paperwork suggested deliberate alteration, with revisions made after the fact and no transparent documentation of why changes were necessary. This raised two disturbing possibilities. Either the investigation suffered from chronic negligence and procedural failures, or the documents were intentionally modified to support a predetermined conclusion. Crime scene photographs deepened these concerns. Several close-up images revealed darkened marks on the backs of Crystal's hands and on the inner sides of her thighs. There was also the visibly damaged fingernail. These were physical details that could indicate a struggle, defensive wounds, or trauma inflicted before death. Yet in the official autopsy report, these marks were either described in the vaguest terms or omitted entirely. Despite the medical examiner's assertion that the dark patches on Crystal's body were typical signs of post-mortem lividity, their location, shape, and distribution told a different story. The marks on the inner thighs, along with uneven, blotchy discoloration on the backs of her hands, did not match the patterns typically associated with natural post-mortem blood pooling. Lividity usually presents as broad, uniform discoloration in the lowest parts of the body. The marks on Crystal's body were localized, irregular, and more consistent with bruising caused by external pressure, gripping, restraint, or blunt force contact. Jana went through the crime scene photographs frame by frame. She noted that the skin discoloration remained consistent regardless of lighting angle or camera perspective, ruling out the possibility that it was simply a photographic artifact. There were no indications in the photographs of tight clothing, jewelry, or objects pressing against the skin that might have created similar marks. What the images did show was alarming, patterns consistent with someone having been forcibly held or restrained. The broken fingernail added another troubling layer. The damage appeared consistent with blunt force trauma or scraping against a hard surface, the kind of injury that might occur if someone had struggled, grasped at an object, or tried to defend themselves. Yet the case files contained no record of fingernail scrapings, no collection of trace evidence from beneath the nails, no testing for fibers, skin particles, or DNA that might have been transferred during a physical altercation. These were standard procedures in any suspicious death investigation, yet they were not performed. The official account relied heavily on the concept of livor mortis to explain the discoloration on Crystal's body, but even this explanation was full of gaps. The expected diagnostic methods, such as applying pressure to the skin to check for blanching, a key indicator that distinguishes lividity from bruising, were not documented. There were no reference photographs using measurement scales or color charts to provide objective comparison. Basic details such as ambient temperature, time intervals between death and discovery, and precise body positioning all of which are essential for interpreting lividity, were absent from the reports. Instead, the photographs suggested something far more immediate and troubling. The marks appeared to be the result of direct physical contact inflicted before death, possibly indicating defensive wounds or signs of a struggle. Yet none of this made it into the official autopsy report. The failure to document these findings, the lack of supporting laboratory tests, and the omission of these details from the final conclusions stripped the case of crucial evidence and made the ruling of suicide increasingly difficult to accept. The family saw what happened next as a turning point in their understanding of Tony's motives. Just days after Crystal's funeral, Tony went to file a life insurance claim. He expected to collect $63,000, but he was informed that Crystal had not been included on the policy, a decision that had been made by Tony's supervisor at State Farm, a woman named Renee. Tony's response was immediate and telling. He marched into the State Farm office where Crystal had worked and demanded the money. The lack of emotion, the absence of grief stunned Crystal's former colleagues. They had expected a grieving husband. What they saw was a man focused on financial compensation, on asserting entitlement, on securing a payout. Then, only 5 days after Crystal's death, Tony began sending intimate messages to one of her co-workers. The messages were not subtle, they were not ambiguous. They were explicit expressions of romantic interest sent before Crystal's body had even been cremated. There was no period of mourning, no outward display of grief, no attempts to support his sons through their loss. Instead, there was cold confidence, a sense that he had already moved on, that Crystal's death had been not a tragedy, but a transition. Crystal's younger son refused to return to the house. He chose instead to live with his Aunt Jana, unable to face the place where his mother had died. He withdrew into silence, unwilling or unable to talk about what had happened. Crystal's older son tried to seek justice. He went to the police, asked for the case to be reopened, pleaded for a more thorough investigation. Every request met the same response. The case was closed. Meanwhile, Tony remained employed at the sheriff's department, continuing his duties as if nothing had happened. He did not attend Crystal's memorial service. He avoided contact with her family. He stayed away from the children. His complete absence of grief, his lack of compassion, his refusal to engage with those mourning Crystal's loss convinced those closest to her of one thing. Her death had not been a tragedy to him. It had been a solution. Crystal's co-workers at State Farm remembered the final months of her life with painful clarity. She had been taking medication prescribed for anxiety and insomnia, medications that came with challenging side effects, drowsiness, emotional numbness, difficulty concentrating. She once told a colleague that she felt like a zombie, disconnected from herself. But even in that state, she was unequivocal about one thing. She was holding on for her sons. She spoke openly about the strain in her marriage, about Tony's controlling behavior, about feeling trapped, but never once did she express a desire to end her life. On the contrary, she talked about her sons' futures. She made plans for work projects that extended weeks and months ahead. She discussed upcoming family events. Later, investigators selectively quoted fragments of these conversations, stripped of context, and used them as evidence of an unstable mental state. They took a woman who had been struggling with a difficult marriage, with the side effects of medication, with exhaustion, and reframed her as someone who had simply decided to disappear from her own life. It was a narrative that fit the conclusion they had already reached, and it spared them the burden of conducting a more thorough investigation. Once the initial ruling was made, the investigation moved quickly toward closure. Signs of potential violence were dismissed or ignored. Questions that should have been foundational were never asked. The ballistic analysis was virtually non-existent. There was no trajectory analysis to determine the angle and path of the bullet through the pillow. There was no testing for soot, powder residue, or stippling on the fabric, which would have indicated the distance between the muzzle and the target at the time of discharge. There was no comparison between the number of rounds remaining in the magazine and the position of the slide to determine whether the weapon had functioned as expected. There were no test firings under controlled conditions to replicate the mechanical failure Tony claimed had occurred, the failure to chamber a new round after the shot was fired. No expert reports were included in the case file confirming the plausibility of a self-inflicted gunshot fired from that specific angle, under those specific conditions, with that specific weapon. The paperwork was riddled with internal contradictions. Reports contained conflicting timestamps. Photographic references did not match the lists of actual images in the evidence log. Case file numbers changed from one document to another with no explanation. And then there was the most glaring issue of all, the conflict of interest. Key interviews, investigative decisions, and the final determination were all handled by the very same sheriff's department where Tony Jones was employed. There was no recusal, no request for an external agency to conduct an independent review, no oversight from a neutral third party. Essentially, the investigation into Crystal's death was conducted by Tony's colleagues, the people who worked alongside him every day, who shared coffee breaks with him, who depended on him in the field. These were the very individuals who should have been questioning his version of events most rigorously. Instead, they accepted it without scrutiny. To Crystal's family, the message was clear. The goal was not to uncover the truth. The goal was to close the case as quickly and quietly as possible. The family submitted formal requests for external reviews, for expanded forensic testing, for access to all investigative materials. Each request was denied or ignored. Desperate for answers, they hired a private investigator. He began by interviewing Crystal's co-workers at State Farm, people who had seen her nearly every day in the months before her death. He spoke to family friends, reviewed call logs, compared GPS data from Tony's phone to the timeline he had provided, and examined the photographic documentation and procedural notes. His findings echoed the family's deepest fears. The private investigator's report, while not a substitute for an official criminal investigation, made several things painfully clear. Basic forensic steps had been skipped. The conflict of interest had never been addressed. The conclusion of suicide had been reached without ruling out other possibilities. The investigator noted that in a properly conducted death investigation, even one initially presumed to be a suicide, certain protocols are non-negotiable. Comprehensive scene documentation, toxicology analysis, GSR testing, interviews with all individuals who had recent contact with the deceased, and a review of any evidence suggesting coercion, control, or foul play. In Crystal's case, virtually none of these steps had been completed. The investigation ended swiftly and with no hesitation. The final ruling: self-inflicted gunshot wound. No charges were filed, no follow-up inquiries were conducted, no corrections were made to the errors in the official reports. Every effort by the family to bring in an independent medical examiner or forensic consultant was rejected as unwarranted. The system had spoken, and its verdict was final. It was as if the case had been nothing more than a form to be filled out, a box to be checked, an administrative task to be completed and filed away. On February 20th, 2023, just 11 days after her death, Crystal's body was cremated. The family learned of the cremation after it had already been completed. Jana, who had been desperately trying to arrange for an independent autopsy, was too late to stop it. For her and for Crystal's sons, the cremation was a devastating blow. It eliminated any possibility of a second forensic examination, any hope of recovering physical evidence that might have contradicted the official findings. When Crystal's older son arrived at the crematorium, hoping to bring his mother's ashes home, he was told he did not have the legal authority to claim them. The younger son, still living with Aunt Jana, remained mostly silent for weeks. Then one day, he asked a question that no one could answer. Why didn't they let her stay somewhere, anywhere? With the cremation, the last physical evidence was gone. All that remained were flawed documents, incomplete photographs, and a family's conviction that the truth had been buried along with their chance to prove it. But Jana was not ready to give up. She gathered everything she could: police reports, autopsy records, photographs, witness statements, correspondence with law enforcement. She launched her own investigation, spending nights at her computer, comparing dates, cross-referencing details, consulting with attorneys and independent forensic experts. Crystal's sons supported her every step of the way. They believed the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. Someone had just decided it didn't belong in this case. By then, the fight was no longer just about legal accountability. It had become a battle for Crystal's dignity, for her memory, for the right to have her story told honestly. Her sons became the keepers of that memory. The older one took on the work of collecting documents, reaching out to journalists, sending case files to independent experts. He was determined to prove that his mother would never have chosen to leave them. The younger one, still navigating his teenage years, struggled to return to any semblance of normal life. He kept a photograph of his mother on his phone. Every night he played her favorite song, as if it were his way of speaking to her across the silence. This case reveals something far broader than the death of one woman in a small Louisiana town. It exposes how institutional power, when left unchecked, can shape narratives, suppress evidence, and shield individuals from accountability. Crystal McCrory Jones was not a faceless statistic. She was a mother, a daughter, a sister, a co-worker, a friend. She was someone who made people feel seen, who offered comfort without expecting anything in return, who built a life around care and connection. And when she died under circumstances that demanded scrutiny, the system that should have protected her memory instead closed ranks around the man she had lived with, the man who had access, opportunity, and motive. The questions raised by this case are not speculative. They are grounded in documented inconsistencies, procedural failures, and forensic gaps that should trouble anyone who believes in the integrity of death investigations. How does a bullet casing appear 9 days after a scene has been cleared? Why was a time of death revised by more than 6 hours with no supporting data? Why were marks consistent with bruising and defensive wounds dismissed as post-mortem lividity without proper testing? Why was no GSR analysis conducted? Why was the body cremated before the family could secure an independent examination? And perhaps most troubling of all, why was an investigation into the death of a deputy's wife conducted entirely by that deputy's colleagues with no external oversight? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the foundation of a case that remains in the eyes of Crystal's family and many who have reviewed the evidence unresolved. The official narrative says Crystal McCrory Jones took her own life on the morning of February 9, 2023. But the evidence, what little of it was properly collected and documented, tells a more complicated story. It tells a story of a woman who was planning for the future, who had scheduled a doctor's appointment, who was concerned about her health, who was talking to her sons about the weekend ahead. It tells a story of a husband whose timeline shifted with each retelling, who did not rush home when his wife stopped responding, who called a colleague instead of checking on her himself, who showed no grief in the days that followed, who within days was pursuing another woman. It tells a story of a death investigation conducted without rigor, without independence, without the basic protections that are supposed to ensure justice for the deceased. And it tells a story of a family that has refused to accept a convenient lie, that has fought for years to have their questions heard, their evidence reviewed, their loved one's memory honored. Crystal's case is a reminder that true crime is not entertainment. It is not a puzzle to be solved for the satisfaction of closure. It is the record of real lives, real losses, real failures of the systems we trust to protect us. For Crystal's sons, for her sister Jana, for everyone who knew and loved her, the fight for truth continues. They carry her memory forward, not as a victim defined by the manner of her death, but as a person defined by the way she lived, with warmth, with resilience, with an unshakable commitment to the people she loved. And they carry forward a question that the system has never adequately answered. What really happened in the bedroom of Crystal McCrory Jones?